So a little over a month ago, I came out on this channel and announced that I have diagnosed myself with Schizoid Personality Disorder. And I promised that I would start making videos about schizoid, and we need them desperately because there's so little reputable information out there available on the internet regarding Schizoid PD. So today I am going to deliver on that promise, and I am going to start with an introduction to Schizoid PD. And I'm going to start by telling you this disorder is an absolute beast. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it is a personality disorder. And so when we're talking about personality disorders, there are a lot of moving parts to a personality disorder. So that automatically means that there's a rabbit hole to go down. There's so much to explore when it comes to any personality disorder, whether it's narcissistic PD or borderline PD or obsessive compulsive PD or schizoid. But when it comes to schizoid, there are actually two rabbit holes, not just one. Obviously, you've got the personality disorder aspect of this condition. But the other rabbit hole is the schizophrenia side of this. Now, what we're going to do today is we are not going to go down either rabbit hole. We're not going to set foot down there. We're just going to stand at the edge of each rabbit hole and just kind of like peek so we can kind of see what's down there. But that's as far as we're going to go because, like I said, this is a lot. So I'm actually going to start with the schizophrenia rabbit hole. I would say this is the smaller rabbit hole and this is the lesser known rabbit hole. So let's start with this one. The first thing I want to say is that this condition, Schizoid PD, is related to schizophrenia. So let's start by looking at the DSM-V criteria for Schizoid PD. And I'm just going to put them up on the slide. I'm not going to read them off to you. You can read them yourself. But when you look at these criteria at first glance, you might say to yourself, I don't understand. Why is this a problem? In fact, I first encountered this disorder when I was in grad school, and I said the exact same thing. Why is this a thing? I don't understand. So people don't want to hang out with other people, and that is somehow a disorder? What is the problem? Well, what I didn't know back then is that the criteria for Schizoid PD could be considered what we call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, there are positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And when we're talking about positive and negative symptoms, we're not saying that there are good symptoms and bad symptoms. It's not good versus bad, but it's more a matter of addition and subtraction. So the idea of a positive symptom of schizophrenia is when you take an otherwise normal person and you add certain symptoms to that person's psychological profile. Negative symptoms of schizophrenia would be the symptoms that you subtract from an otherwise normal psychological profile. So positive symptoms would be things like delusions, hallucinations, bizarre beliefs, anything that we would more or less label psychotic. So we're adding symptoms of psychosis to the person's psychological profile. Negative symptoms would be the things that we would take away. So that would include the desire to socialize, the desire or the ability rather to experience pleasure, the ability to feel motivated, etc., etc. So when we look at the positive and negative symptoms, and then we look at the criteria for schizoid, what we see is that schizoid PD outwardly is expressed in terms of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. That means that people with schizoid, they don't have hallucinations, they're not psychotic, they're 100% in touch with reality, they're completely lucid, but they seem to be lacking these other traits that everyone else seems to enjoy. They lack the desire to be with other people. They lack the ability to feel pleasure. And as a matter of fact, these negative symptoms are often called the 5 A's of schizophrenia. So the 5 A's of schizophrenia would be affective flattening, alogia, asociality, anhedonia, and avolition. So when we look at the DSM-V criteria for schizoid, now we're starting to see this is somebody whose DSM behavioral symptoms, the outward symptoms, seem to match these 5 A's of schizophrenia. And I would say there's a special emphasis in schizoid on 3 of those 5 A's. It would be the affective flattening, which would be like a reduced range of emotional expression. You definitely see just in these DSM-5 criteria, definitely see the asociality. And of course, you definitely see some symptoms that correspond to anhedonia. Now, if you talk to people with schizoid, you will also hear them talk about avolition, a reduced motivation to get things done or to pursue certain projects that give them purpose. And you'll also hear them talk about alogia, like a reduced desire to engage in conversation, especially when it comes to small talk. So that's the schizophrenia rabbit hole. Now you know when you look at the DSM-5 criteria, it's not just that this is a super introvert and this shouldn't be a disorder. There's a reason why these particular criteria made it into the book, okay? Now, let's step away from the schizophrenia rabbit hole and let's walk over to the edge of the personality disorder rabbit hole. And we're just going to peek inside there. We're not going to go down there. Like I said, it's just we're going to get lost. Trust me. So standing on the edge of the personality disorder rabbit hole, what do we see? Well, first and foremost, the very first thing we need to acknowledge is that this is a personality disorder. It is listed in the DSM-5 under the personality disorder section. And so what that means, first and foremost, is that somebody with schizoid PD has to meet the criteria for a general personality disorder. And this is true of every PD. You can't just look at the criteria and say, oh, yep, that's me. I have such and such personality disorder. You have to meet the criteria for the general personality disorder. And so very briefly, that criteria reads as follows. It's an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture. The pattern is manifested in 2 or more of the following areas. So we have cognition, which is ways of perceiving and interpreting self, others, and events. Affectivity, which would be the range, intensity, lability, and appropriateness of emotional response. And finally, we have interpersonal functioning and impulse control. And this enduring pattern is inflexible. It's pervasive across a broad range of personal and social situations. And the pattern leads to clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So there's a lot that I could say about this, but I want to keep this introduction brief. And so I'm only going to point out a few things. First, I want to draw your attention to affectivity. And I'm going to say right off the bat that Schizoid PD definitely experiences difficulties in the area of affectivity because Schizoid PD is defined overall as a pattern of detachment from social relationships and a limited range of emotional expression. So when you have a limited range of emotional expression, that is going to cause problems with your communication. And I can definitely testify my own experience as well as my schizoid client. We both have a restricted range of emotional expression. My schizoid client has a much more flattened affect. I do not, but I still have very muted emotions. And one of the things that we have both discovered is that people don't take us seriously. And that's because when we're trying to communicate, our emotional intensity is not matching our words. And so we try to tell people, hey, this is very serious, or I'm very upset right now. Nobody really believes us. Nobody really takes us seriously because our emotions are not matching the intensity of our words. So you can imagine how this would cause problems personality-wise. This would cause problems in communication with every person you come in contact with. Now, the other thing that I'm going to point out is cognition and interpersonal. And the primary reason why schizoid is a personality disorder is because of something called whole object relations. And I have been looking into something called the Masterson approach over the last several months. The Masterson approach explains that there are 3 basic personality disorders: narcissistic PD, borderline PD, and schizoid PD. Why just these 3? Because these are your 3 primary disorders whose issues are rooted in whole object relations. What does that mean? Whole object relations is more or less the ability to see conflicting situations in an integrated manner. So somebody who has whole object relations, for example, can see good and bad in the same person. When it comes to schizoid PD, schizoid also has an issue with whole object relations because the way that the schizoid experiences relationships is in a dynamic known as the master-slave dynamic. And every time a schizoid individual gets into a relationship, the other person is the master and the schizoid is the slave. Or the schizoid perceives this dynamic. Remember, this is still a personality disorder. So sometimes the schizoid is 100% accurate in their evaluation that I'm the slave, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they can be in an equal partnership, but because of the personality disorder, the disordered patterns, the disordered ways of thinking and perceiving situations, even though they're in an equal relationship, they may see themselves as being in the slave role, even though they're not. So what happens is that they are unable to resolve that. And so what they do in an attempt to resolve that is to swing that pendulum all the way to the opposite extreme, and that is to isolate themselves. And this is called self in exile. And you will typically see schizoid people either going from one extreme to the next, these unsatisfying relationships where they feel like they are the slave, or they're completely isolated altogether. Now, sometimes a schizoid person will try very, very hard to manage these relationships in kind of like a half-hearted way. And this is called the schizoid compromise. So basically you're looking at somebody who's schizoid getting into a relationship with somebody who lives halfway across the world, or somebody who's married, or somebody who has some obstacle to being able to have a fully unobstructed relationship. And that's because the schizoid person is trying to keep a distance from that intimacy. They don't really want to be fully into that relationship. And the reason is because they perceive that other person as annihilating their identity. That other person is trampling on their sense of individuality. And since they're not able to work that out, a lot of times they will just leave and then choose a period of isolation. And as I said, it goes back and forth. So again, probably opened up a whole bunch of questions. But like I said, the answers to those questions are found in the rabbit hole, and we are not going down the rabbit hole today. We're just looking at the rabbit holes. We're just getting to know the rabbit holes. We will get much more deep into these topics in future videos. But for today, I just wanted to give you a basic introduction, a basic idea of why this disorder is a disorder. I hope this has been helpful to you. I'm Jen Guerriero, and this is Poisonous People. Thanks for watching.